Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim, here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing very well today, Tim. Thank you so much for asking. I hope everyone listening is doing very well also. We have a return guest. He's one of the favorites. He's one of the best storytellers that we have on this show, and we've been embarking on this journey covering the Bennington Triangle in Vermont, and he's joined us 2 other times to cover other disappearances. This is the 3rd appearance here, and there will be more, but Tim, I'm going on and on. How are you today?
Doing great over here. And yes, we are joined once again by Ross Griffiths, the Worcester State University Archives librarian. He's joined us here on the airwaves to speak about these Bennington Triangle disappearances, but he also joined us to speak about Etta Reel back in September of 2024. So yeah, we spoke about Mitty Rivers, who disappeared in 1945, Paula Weldon, who disappeared in 1946, and today we're speaking about the disappearance of James Tedford from 1949, specifically December 1st, 1949. And so these 3 cases are part of the Bennington Triangle disappearances. There are a couple more that we will speak with Ross about very soon. But this disappearance, Lance, very mysterious. James Tedford was 68 years old. He was a World War I veteran, and he went missing basically from a bus. And there is a lot of information out there about James Tedford's case if you look into it, but a lot of it is not super accurate. And we'll talk about that more in final thoughts after we go through the case with Ross. And we'll get into some of the specifics of how what Ross presents differs from what other folks have presented about his disappearance.
Yes, really looking forward to the final thoughts at the end of the episode because we do have a lot to say about this mysterious disappearance, especially what you just mentioned. Ross has this way of bringing information to the listener that has been so thoroughly researched. All of the things that you read about James Tedford that seem to be super mysterious and that he just poofed into thin air, and some of the other details aren't accurate. But the way Ross delivers the corrections is just as riveting as the mysterious elements that have been made up over the course of the years that James Tedford has been missing. And Tim, I want to remind you and I want to remind the listeners that in just a couple of days, just a few days from now, we are going to have our virtual fundraiser for the nonprofit that we are on the board of, Private Investigations for the Missing. This is the nonprofit that Bruce Maitland started. Bruce Maitland, of course, is Breonna Maitland's father, and Breonna Maitland disappeared in 2004. So Bruce decided to start this nonprofit in honor of her, and it is to provide professional investigative services to families of missing loved ones at no cost to the family. And we are honored to be on the board, and it's been far too long since we've done a virtual fundraiser for this fine organization. So this is going to be on Wednesday, June 11th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Missing YouTube channel. So at Missing CSM on YouTube, you can join, you can contribute, you can listen to the plethora of amazing guests that are going to be on the show.
Okay, everyone, so we are going to be back for final thoughts at the end of the interview with Ross, and we'll get into our opinions. So we are going to break real quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back to speak about the disappearance of James Tedford with Ross Griffiths. Welcome back to the podcast, Ross Griffiths. Ross, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you guys?
We're doing great. You're back. We're talking about more disappearances in this region in New England, this Bennington Triangle series that we're continuing. But as much as I want to get right into this as quickly as possible, can you remind the listeners who you are, what you do, and what brings you on the show today?
Yeah, I'm Ross Griffiths. I'm archives librarian at Worcester State University. And one of my interests, of course, is history, archives, special collections, primary sources, how to use primary sources to teach and learn about history. And I think that true crime provides interesting opportunities to explore those sources. I think a lot of true crime researchers and fans are doing historical research. using primary sources, databases, public records. And so I think it's interesting to sort of talk about these cases using that as a lens, and then also maybe try to untangle some of these mysteries and figure out what's going on.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining us here again. And so this is now the third conversation that we're having about the Bennington Triangle disappearances. First was Mitty Rivers from 1945. Second was Paula Weldon from 1946. And today we're going to be speaking about James Tedford, which is a pretty interesting case. Yeah, can you tell us a bit about James?
Yeah, James Tedford was a man in his mid-60s who was a resident of the Vermont Soldiers' Home in Bennington, who disappeared while returning to Bennington from a visit home farther north in Vermont, up near Burlington, Vermont. And so in some ways, his case is an outlier here because we don't know exactly where he was when whatever happened. We do know where he was last seen. But there is some mystery here. And unlike the Weldon case, it didn't attract a lot of media attention. There were a number of articles in the newspapers for about a month and a half after the disappearance, but it dried up pretty quickly. And I think that gives us some opportunity to talk about why certain cases get attention and why they don't. Weldon was attractive young college student from an upper middle class family, going to a college where there were powerful people who were connected to politics and culture. And so there was a lot more attention on her case because of that. Whereas Rivers was a guy who had been a farmer most of his life. He didn't have a lot of status or money. And I think when the true crime world, we sometimes talk about the less dead, the less missing. Those people, because of their social status, don't get as much attention. And I think Tedford fits into that scenario a little bit. And his case wouldn't be linked with this larger cluster of disappearances in the public's imagination until about a year after he disappeared. And people began looking back and identifying missing persons cases in this region. It's also a bit of an outlier because where Tedford might have disappeared from is about 70 miles north of the Bennington area. So if we want to draw the Bennington Triangle, it makes the top of the triangle pretty high up in this case. But his case is one of those canonical cases that's discussed when people talk about the Bennington Triangle. And like all of these cases, it's gotten mixed up with a lot of folklore and a lot of misinformation. So hopefully this discussion today can clear up some of those more sensationalistic aspects to Tedford's disappearance. So maybe what we can do is talk about the circumstances of his disappearance and then talk about his life a little bit, because when you look at the life of somebody, sometimes it gives you clues. I mentioned that he boarded a bus in the town of St. Albans on a Thursday afternoon. He was seen at Burlington at the bus terminal preparing to transfer to another bus, and then he's gone. He never returns to the soldiers' home, and it takes a week before his disappearance is reported to police. And I think there are some fairly understandable reasons why that happened, but let's put a pin in that, and we'll come back to the reasons why it might have taken so long. So who was James Tedford? Like a lot of people who lived relatively quiet lives, it's a little hard to trace his life history. It appears as though he was born in May of 1882, and I say appears because the birth record that I found states May of 1882, born in Concord, Vermont, to parents who were Canadian immigrants. But there's a lot of discrepancies with his birth date appearing early on in census records and other records. It wasn't unusual in those days for people to not know exactly how old they were. If your parents died when you were relatively young, his mother died when he was an infant, there might not be a birth certificate around. You might know your birth date, but maybe the year gets lost in translation. It's not entirely unheard of. He did, however, have an older brother who he remained in close contact with, so I think the brother would have remembered when he was born. But at any rate, there is this kind of 2-year discrepancy, and there is a bigger discrepancy that appears later on, which we'll talk about. At any rate, by around 1900, when Tedford was a young man, he was living as a farm laborer with a family by the name of Brown. And then 10 years later, he's living as a laborer with a family named Home. So what this means is that he was the hired man on a farm. He might have lived in a cottage On the grounds of the farm, he might have lived in a bedroom with the family and had meals with the family. This was not a bad way to live, and it wasn't an unusual way to live 120 years ago in the country. Chances are these families might have been known to Tedford when he was growing up. It's a very small community, let's remember. And so you're kind of, maybe your dad's friend from across the way needs a farm laborer, so you go live with your dad's friend and his family. And maybe you move around a little bit. Maybe you spend 6 months with this family, and then during sugar season, when they're tapping maple trees, maybe you move over here. It's a lot of hard work, a lot of outdoor work, but in general, you ate pretty well. You had a community of people, so it wasn't really a bad way to live. It just wasn't a way to live that made you a lot of money or got you a lot of status. So that was really Tedford's life for most of his teenage years and adult years. In 1917, as the U.S. is approaching World War I, Tedford ends up enlisting in the Vermont militia. Now, this was a militia that was created when the federal government began nationalizing National Guard troops from different states. So we're gearing up to enter the war. All able-bodied young men had to enter the service. So Tedford registers for the draft. He ends up entering the service, from what I've been able to determine, late in the war, around 1918 in September. And that means it's questionable whether he would have seen combat or not, because the armistice would have been November of 18. The records I found show Tedford was inducted in September of 18. So there could have been a lot of soldiers went through basic training, then there was the armistice, and they stayed behind in the States. But if he had had some basic training in the militia, he might have been shipped off. And if he had been, it's possible he might have been involved in some very significant battles that happened toward the end of September, in October of that year. People have seen the movie Dunkirk, might get a sense of the sort of combat conditions these young men were dealing with. But we don't know. We don't know exactly where he was during his war service, but we know that he served, and we know that that's how he got veteran status. By the 1920s, Tedford's life is on the upswing. In 1928, he purchases his own farm, and he does some improvements to the farm. In October of that year, he gets married to a woman named Pearl Mitchell. And at this point, he's about 44 or 45 years old. And in 1930, for the U.S. Census, he and Pearl are living on this farm near the village of Fletcher. And I want to point out how interesting it is to do research in small town newspapers from this era, because they had a kind of society page that included really minor details about people's lives. Mr. and Mrs. Smith had a visit from their daughter who was home from college. Mrs. Jones hosted the 4-H club at her home on Sunday. There were a lot of small towns that had kind of for lack of a better word, a local busybody who would call in news to the newspapers. And so you got these little pieces of Tedford's life. He and his brother go visit this relative over here. He ends up having dinner with this family over here. So you get a sense that he has this extended family. He has these friends, these long-term friends in this community. And that's the life that he's living. There is a strange thing happening with Tedford's age during this period. I mentioned 1882 is what the official birth record says. By 1900, 1910, it looks like it's 1884. And I'm thinking, is this the same James Tedford? But everything I look at, it seems like it's the same guy. His marriage record, the marriage registration, he's listed as being 34 years old in 1928. Well, that doesn't make any sense. He would have been at least 44. 1930 census, he's 36 years old. And let's remember how the census was taken. A census taker came to your house with a ledger book and a pen and asked you questions. Who lives in this household? Where are they from? What do they do? How old are they? Somebody in the Tedford household told the census taker he was 36 years old. By 1940, Tedford is 56 in the census. So what's going on here? What is this 10-year age gap? Well, if you look at the census record from 1930, when Tedford married Pearl Mitchell, she was about 16. Now, in a country town in 1928, it was not unheard of for a 16-year-old girl to get married. There were financial incentives to get your kids out of the house under someone else's roof. If you were a family that didn't have a lot of money, for example. And the Mitchells seemed like they were a pretty ordinary family, didn't have a lot of income. Mrs. Mitchell had died in 1919, so it was Mr. Mitchell single dad raising kids. So it would have stood to reason that his daughter Pearl would have married at 16. But I still think that your daughter marrying a 44-year-old bachelor farmer might be a little weird, even by the standards of the age. And I wonder if Tedford might have shaved 10 years off his age at that point. Obviously, by our standards today, 34 and 16 is still wildly inappropriate, but maybe there was a reason for that. That is a mystery. There's a story there. But without knowing more details about these people's lives, we may never know what that story was. But maybe we'll look back at that story before we wrap up this particular story today. So he's living his life, small farmer in Vermont, very typical life. His farm is horse-powered, so he has horses pulling machinery in the 1930s, not altogether unusual. Suffers a minor injury, actually. Horse throws him off a piece of machinery. He cuts his arm. But things begin to go south during the decade of the 40s. In 1940, Tedford spends a month as a patient in the Veterans Hospital at White River Junction, Vermont. This is in eastern Vermont, near the New Hampshire state line. The papers don't say why he was there, but he was there from the end of September to the end of October 1940. That's a pretty long stay in a hospital. And this was an acute care hospital. This wasn't a nursing home or sort of a retirement facility. So we don't know why he was there. Was this minor surgery and there were complications and he had to stay? Was there some underlying health problem? But I think it's important because a few years later, in 1945, there's a big red flag in Tedford's life. He is arrested for animal cruelty for starving one of his horses, possibly to death. And this is a huge red flag for a couple of reasons. Obviously, any kind of animal neglect or abuse is a sign of a dysfunctional life. There's something wrong with a person who does this. But when your farm is literally powered by horses, you keep your horses healthy. You depend on your horses to get the crops in. You depend on your horses for your whole livelihood. So he's neglecting a horse so badly that he's dragged into court. And make no mistake, the standards for animal abuse in the mid-40s in a country town were pretty different than ours are today. So you can be sure that what happened was pretty bad. He pays bail. He ends up pleading no contest, pays a fine. He's sent back home again. But 2 years later, he and his wife move into an apartment. And my analysis of this is that they sold the farm, that he retires from farming after this horse incident. And they relocate to what's described as a tenement. Now, today we think of that as a slum. In 1940s lingo, that would likely have been an apartment in a house in a little village of North Cambridge in Vermont. So he's residing in North Cambridge with his wife in this apartment. And in 1948, in September, he is admitted to the Vermont Soldiers' Home in Bennington. He is suffering from a heart ailment and malnutrition, which I think is an interesting feature considering what happened to that horse a few years earlier. There's a lot of reasons why somebody might be malnourished. There could be an underlying health condition that makes it hard to eat, or there could be a psychological condition. People with depression, people with anxiety sometimes have trouble eating. And so there's something going wrong with Tedford's health at this point, either mentally or physically. And so when you sort of put together these isolated events from the 1940s, culminating in him going to the veterans home or the soldiers home, I think we can see that there's a decline. There's a decline of health. He is no longer able to live on his own with his wife. He needs extra care. And so he's at the soldiers' home, which is like assisted living. That's essentially where he's living. And those are the circumstances of his life at the time of his disappearance, which would occur about a year later.
In addition to the theory that you have about why he might have shaved some years off of his life and the animal cruelty, like that's tragic. Starving a horse to death is, I can't even imagine how long that would take. But was there anything else about him that was mysterious? Like, how did people view him in town or, anything like that?
He seemed to live a pretty normal life. We don't have a lot of input either before or after the disappearance as to what his personality was like. He was known around town. There were accounts in the newspapers that he did a lot walking around. He was a walker, so people saw him walking along the roads. People would see him in town. If you look at those little social columns in the newspaper, he's often traveling with his wife. They're going to Burlington to do something. They go visit a cousin over here to do something. His wife lives in close proximity to her sister and husband, so his sister and brother-in-law live nearby. So there's nothing that jumps out as strange or abnormal about his life. He's part of this community. So I don't know that we can point to anything particularly strange about him, or strange enough that it shows up in the papers later on.
What about his marriage? Were they together at the time of his disappearance?
It appears as though they were. It's unclear the exact address. Now, they moved into that apartment in North Cambridge in 1947. When he was visiting home before he disappeared, it's described as being in the village of Fletcher. But those are places that are pretty close together. And some of these little towns, there's a town that gets mentioned a lot called Binghamville, but Binghamville is part of Fletcher. So it was certainly the same geographical region. Now, whether it was the same apartment or not is unclear to me. It's possible that the wife had moved in with her sister and brother-in-law, because it seems like the three of them are together a lot in newspapers, and they're mentioned a lot in subsequent coverage of his disappearance. But it does seem like they were living together as of 1947. Now, I don't see any children in the picture, so it seems unlikely they had kids together. So they would have been, he would have been elderly, she would have been middle-aged, sort of farm couple living in the country.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
I actually contacted the Burlington Veterans Home, which is what it's called now, and was able to talk to an administrator who gave me some information about what they have on James Tedford. He scheduled leave from the Veterans Home from November 17th of 49 until December 4th, which was a Sunday. And this is a period of a little over 2 weeks. It would encompass Thanksgiving holiday. So we can imagine that he travels home with the intent of spending a couple of weeks with his family, having Thanksgiving dinner, catching up with his old friends before he would then return to the Veterans Home. For reasons that are not described in any of these documents, rather than returning on December 4th, he returns on Thursday the 1st. And that's the first problem with his disappearance, which is that it set up a situation where his absence wasn't noticed for a couple of days. But they don't know that yet. So his wife and brother-in-law take him to the bus station at St. Albans. And when the police talk to the brother-in-law, he describes Tedford's demeanor as despondent. He does not want to return to the Veterans Home. He wants to stay with his family. Maybe he wanted to talk them into having him come back home again. We don't know what happened, but he was unhappy about having to return to Bennington. And let's remember, he'd spent his entire life in this region of Vermont. His whole family was there. All of his friends were there. His whole life was there. And he's about 140 miles south in Bennington, where he doesn't know anybody. So he doesn't want to be there. And it's pretty common for older people in failing health to not want to go to a nursing home to live. This is not an unusual situation. So he's unhappy, he's despondent, but they put him on the bus anyway. That bus, which is a Clay Lines bus, this is a private local regional bus service that operated at that point, takes him from St. Albans at 1:30 in the afternoon down to Burlington, to the bus depot in the city of Burlington. It's about a 30 to 45 minute trip. So he would get to Burlington maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon. From that point, he would have had about a 4-hour layover, because the bus to Bennington, which was a Vermont transit bus, would have departed Burlington about 6:15. So he would have had about 4 hours to hang out in Burlington. While he was at the bus depot in Burlington, he runs into an old friend, a guy named Walter Lemna. Lemna talks to Tedford. Tedford's demeanor is totally normal. He mentions he's living at the soldiers' home. He's waiting for a bus to take him back there. They pass the time. A completely ordinary conversation, no red flags. So we go from despondent at 1:30, boarding the bus, to seemingly normal at some point later. The Vermont Transit Company tell the police they are certain that Tedford boarded that second bus. They don't say how they're certain, but it sounds like there was a ticketing situation that would have confirmed he boarded the bus at 6:15. It's possible he had purchased a round-trip ticket on November 17th that had a date stamped on it. It's possible there may have been a transfer slip he got from that first bus line, but there was some confirmation the police were satisfied with that he did in fact board that second bus. But that sighting in Burlington is the last confirmed sighting of Tedford when he chats to his old friend. From that point, things get very murky. That bus ride to Bennington would have taken about 3 hours, and there would have been, from what the schedule looks like, about 6 stops along the way. So he should have pulled into Bennington probably around 9:30, 9 o'clock, 9:30 p.m. At about 11 p.m. that night, in the village of Brandon, which is about 3 stops south of Burlington, about 90 minutes into this trip, something strange happens. A cab driver parked in Brandon sees a strange man, quote unquote, acting queerly. Now, what this meant in 1949 was eccentric, strange, off-putting. There was something weird about what this guy was doing. Didn't say what it was. Maybe he was pacing around, talking to himself. Something weird was happening. It was weird enough that this cab driver contacted the police. And the Brandon police went out to that spot. There's no guy there. They don't see anybody. But when the police who are looking for Tedford talk to this cab driver, and describe what Tedford looked like, the cab driver says, that might have been him. Older guy wearing an army coat and a gray suit and a beret. That's how he was dressed. That might have been Tedford. When the police talked to the bus driver on that Vermont transit bus, the driver doesn't remember Tedford boarding, but he does remember someone who might have been Tedford getting off the bus in Brandon at 8 p.m. So we have this confirmed sighting at Burlington, and then we have a guy who might have been Tedford getting off the bus at Brandon. And then 3 hours later at 11 o'clock, we have this weird guy observed by a cab driver in Brandon. And that's kind of the end of it, of this story. There are no more confirmed sightings. There are people, once the story gets in the newspaper, there are people that come forward claiming maybe they saw him. Couple of days after Tedford disappears, an acquaintance of his saw someone who looked like him hitching a ride up near Vergennes. But this is north of Brandon. This is just south of Burlington. So that didn't make a lot of sense that he would have hitchhiked north again, unless he was trying to get back home. We don't know why he would have gotten off in Brandon. Brandon's a really small, almost a village. The bus stop, I think, in 1949 would have been at the Brandon Inn. This was an old red brick hotel. It's still there today. I have a very mundane theory, which is maybe he had to go to the bathroom. If you look at these Vermont transit buses that were being used, they weren't like modern Greyhound buses that have a little bathroom in the back. 90 minutes into the trip, he's an older guy. Maybe he gets off to use the bathroom at the Brandon Inn, and he tarries too long and the bus pulls away without him. We don't know. It's a mystery as to why this place would have been an attraction to him at all.
Were his belongings accounted for?
There aren't any references to any personal belongings. No luggage, no satchel, nothing. Going back to your question about the living arrangements up in Fletcher, I suspect because he was going back to his old home that he would have had clothing, toiletries, etc., shaving kit back in Fletcher at home. So he might have only traveled with what he had in his pockets. But these original accounts of the case don't describe any luggage at all or any personal belongings. In subsequent retellings of the story, there are claims there was luggage left behind on the bus, but there's no evidence there was any luggage. So no personal belongings. And while we're on the topic, no evidence he had a lot of money with him or that he had access to a lot of money. So, probably enough money to buy bus fare. I assume when he got back to Bennington, he would have called a cab, possibly. And so he would have had a buck or two for a cab fare. But this Brandon connection is really where the trail kind of ends. When the police talk to residents at the Soldiers' Home, at least two of these residents come forward and say, when Tedford left, he said he wasn't coming back. He said, you're never going to see me again. So we have this impression then that Tedford intended to not return. How seriously we should take that, we don't know. Maybe he said that every time he went home. Maybe he'd been trying to work on his family for a year and a half. Take me back, take me back. We don't have a lot of details as to what that was, but it does present the possibility that he had a plan to disappear. And yet we have no evidence he had the resources to do it.
Did something happen at the veterans home that would set him off?
There's no evidence for that. The veterans home has had a pretty good reputation for providing a good quality of care. And I think it's important to mention there's this lag of reporting his missing. So let's kind of look at the chronology here. He's scheduled to return on Sunday the 4th. I would imagine that means his empty bed wouldn't have raised any concerns until Monday the 5th. And the first steps might have been to call local hospitals, to ask around the home, to try to contact the family. Communication as it was in the late 40s, they might not have been able to get in touch with the family right away. It's possible they went to the police the next day and the police said, you got to wait 24 hours. And so the final report wasn't filed till the 7th. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence of problems at the home. Good quality care, a lot of inspections by state officials. The inspections are mentioned in local newspapers. There's a lot of community involvement at the home. People in Bennington pay attention to these veterans. They have events at the home. They do charity fundraisers. They do Christmas caroling at Christmas time. So I think that life at the home was actually pretty okay, but he was homesick. He was homesick and didn't want to be there. And that's the impression I get from reading through all of these sources. So we don't have evidence that he had motive. We had evidence that he had motive to disappear. We don't have a sense he had the means to do it. And so that leaves a big question mark as to where he might have gone and why.
Right. Wow. So, okay, I just want to talk about the ride real quick. So how long was the ride supposed to be?
Based on timetables I found. Now, these are I found a scan of a timetable online from 1941, another one from about 1951. So somewhere in between, I figured, is the accurate timetable. It looks to me about a 3-hour bus ride. And Brandon would have been roughly the halfway point chronologically, time-wise, less than halfway distance-wise. But it would have been about the middle of the trip.
Okay, and he was pretty familiar with bus trips like this?
I would assume so. He'd been at the home since September of 48. We don't know how often he visited home. It might have been annually or multiple times. But the one aspect to the Brandon connection that's puzzling to me is that besides the fact there isn't really anything to draw him there, he didn't know anybody there, Brandon is not a transit hub. If let's say he was planning to go somewhere else, get on a train to anywhere, right? Burlington is where you would do that. Burlington's the transit hub. Burlington's got the trains and the buses. It makes no sense that a person planning an escape would get off at that point. There's nothing about that really makes any sense. I'm sure the suicide angle was investigated. They didn't come out and say it in the newspapers, but considering the fact that he was despondent, a number of newspaper articles mentioned his mental health was not good overall. That had to be a consideration, but that also begs the question of where would he have been? Unless he just walked and walked and walked until he found a wooded area and just disappeared into the woods. If you look at Brandon from a modern satellite view, it's surrounded by open fields and patches of woods and some wilderness areas. There are no massive bodies of water within walking distance, easy walking distance. It's just an odd place where a person would choose to get off to disappear himself. But it would make sense if he gets off for another reason, like, I got to go to the bathroom, and here's a stop where I can go. Now, of course, what would happen then makes no sense. What happens after that, we don't know.
And that makes sense. That's why he would get off, and it seems like it would be something that is just a normal thing to do. Someone just needing, after 90 minutes on the bus, just needing to use the restroom. And that also might give some sort of indication of why he was acting the way he was acting, if that was him and spotted by that other gentleman, because he probably came out and said, I missed, the bus took off. Like, and he was probably standing there on the street throwing his hands up and saying, like, what am I going to do now?
Now, one thing to keep in mind is the bus stopped at Brandon at 8, and that strange man was seen at 11. So there's a 3-hour window. So if he was sort of freaking out, that would have happened earlier on, but we don't know what he was doing for those 3 hours. Maybe maybe the Brandon Inn had a confusing layout and he was wandering around. Maybe he stopped and got a drink. We don't know. We don't know. But I do think that makes sense. I can see how he's exasperated. He's scared. What do I do now? Where do I go? And that was what the cab driver was observing. There is another possibility, which some people have mentioned in more current or more recent coverage of this, is that he may have been suffering from dementia. They knew what dementia was in 1949. He was under a doctor's care. He would have gotten medical care at the soldiers' home. But if he was in the early stages of dementia, depression can be part of this. Unrealistic thinking. He might have been in really bad health, but he thinks he's going to talk his family into taking him back again, and making room for him at home. It would be possible that he would do something puzzling and irrational. He would get off the bus. People with dementia, things get worse in the early evenings. So if you look at the timetable here, he gets on the first bus at 1:30. He's seen at some point that afternoon in Burlington. He would have boarded that Vermont transit bus at 6:30. But by 6:30, people are sometimes, quote unquote, sundowning. This means your dementia symptoms get worse. And he might have made an irrational decision to get off the bus for whatever reason at Brandon. Or maybe he got off the bus to go to the bathroom, but he got confused, didn't know where he was. He's pacing around in Brandon, muttering to himself, what do I do? That's when the cab driver sees him. Maybe he sees a police car coming and he ducks into an alley. So I think that's possible. And if you look at missing persons cases involving elderly people, it is not at all unheard of that elderly people wander away from caregivers, wander away from nursing homes. So I think we have to be careful about trying to analyze this too rationally. He might not have been in a rational frame of mind, or he might have had a mental illness we don't know about. If we go back to the war service, a lot of guys came back from World War I with trauma, and they knew what it was. They had names for it, but they didn't have a lot of treatment for it. What was that month he spent at the Veterans Hospital in 1940? Because of the fact his mental health was mentioned so much in these articles, I wonder if we're looking at an unfolding mental health crisis. Was he hospitalized for mental health reasons in 1940? Was there another hospitalization that wasn't mentioned? Did the starvation of the horse reflect a person who is losing his ability to live in a functional way? And does his journey to the soldier's home with the malnutrition reflect this deteriorating mental state? And so to me, that scenario, without knowing much more about him, when I look at these kinds of isolated events in his life, you can string that together as a story of a decline of mental health. And then it starts, maybe not to make sense, but then you start to see other possibilities. Well, he might have gotten off the bus, and Brandon being where it was, he walks along country roads. He goes off into the woods. It's December. He is wearing a heavy coat, but for an older guy who's kind of underweight, he never really gained back the weight. He's listed as being emaciated in 1949. He could have succumbed to the elements. And by the time anyone noticed he was missing, he might have been deceased for 4 days. So I think that is a possibility. But it's not a certainty. We're still left with these question marks. I have put out a records request to the Vermont State Police for records related to this, because I would love to see if there are any records related to the police investigation. The Paula Weldon case, you can learn so much about her from those police records. And those researchers we talked about mentioned that, what her personality was like, what her character was like, that shed so much light onto her life and what might have happened to her. In the Tedford case, I have two really big questions. The first is, are we certain he boarded the bus at Burlington?
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
In the Tedford case, I have two really big questions. The first is, are we certain he boarded the bus at Burlington? It does seem like he did because of those maybe sightings in Brandon, but because those are maybes, it's also a maybe that it wasn't him, right? And Burlington would be a place to get off a bus and run away. Maybe he tells this Walter Lemna, I'm cool, everything's good. He doesn't want to let on what's going on. Maybe he conceals that. So that's one question. I really just am curious about how they know that. The second question is, when he talked to those guys down at the veterans home, did he tell them what his plan was? He said, I'm not coming back. But did he say, I'm going to run away? I'm going to talk my wife into letting me move back in. I'm going to disappear myself. Do we have any more details? Because that would also maybe shed light onto what happened. And if there were details to that, they were never published in the newspapers. When the police talked to Tedford's family, they said several years before, Tedford had a desire to go to Florida to live because of the climate. And there was some speculation that maybe when he gets off the bus at Brandon, he walks out to the highway, puts his thumb out. Hitchhiking was a very common way of getting around, as we talked about with the Weldon case. A lot of people would pull over and pick up an old guy thumbing a ride by the side of the road. Did he hitch a ride with a truck driver and end up in Hartford, Connecticut, or Springfield, Massachusetts? The Vermont State Police put out a call to 13 states about the Tedford case, meaning they would have sent a notice to 13 different police departments. So all through New England and the Mid-Atlantic, it sounds like people would have been on the lookout for him, which means if he had ended up in a jail or a hospital, chances are he would have been found because they would have contacted the police and said, does this guy we have match this missing guy? But if he had lived among the homeless, if he had lived, slept in Salvation Army shelters, ate at soup kitchens, hung out at the library or the train station during the day, that sort of twilight world would lend itself to anonymity. And if he had lived like that for 6 months and then died, I think it is possible he would have slipped through the cracks. Because that police notification that went out in December of 49, that would have been under a stack of other papers 6 months later. They might not be looking for him 6 months later. So I do think we have to be open to the possibility that he, quote unquote, started a new life, even though we often assume that means an improved life. Maybe it doesn't mean an improved life. But I'm still not sold on this. If he was in his right mind, this guy wanted to go home. Even if his family rejected him, he wanted to go home. He lived his whole life up there in these little towns. I think if he was in his right mind, he would not have chosen rationally to go away and live rough. But if he was suffering from mental illness or dementia, I think that's a possibility. That's a possibility of what could have happened. And that would explain why he was not found in the Brandon region in spite of them searching around for him.
That would mean that it would have to have been a complete emotional break, right? He wouldn't be going in and out of this dementia, and it wouldn't be gradual, because it sounds like if this was a case leading up to it, this was a gradual descent into dementia.
Yep.
So at this point, he would have had to have just completely gone, because if he had come back around at some point later on, you would have thought that he might look around and say, this isn't where I'm supposed to be. I need to talk to somebody.
Yeah. And it's important, he's despondent at 1:30. A couple hours later, he's okay. Then he disappears. So there isn't a consistent straight line between the second to last sighting and the last sighting. So I think that's true. I think it's correct that there would have had to have been a real collapse of mental health that occurred right around this time. And I don't know that dementia or other sort of mental health conditions necessarily lend themselves to that. It's possible, people do have mental breaks as a result of stress. It could have happened. But if it did happen, he never came around again. He never hitched a ride to another city and then knocked on the door of a Salvation Army and said, I'm James Tedford. I'm 100 miles from home. Give me some help. Because if he had done that, they would have found him.
Can you remind us how many eyewitnesses saw him on the bus?
To my recollection, there aren't any eyewitnesses listed seeing him on the bus. There is the Vermont Transit Company saying he boarded based on some kind of evidence. And there's the bus driver saying someone might have gotten off the bus. And of course, there was the wife and brother-in-law who put him on the first bus in St. Albans. But I have not seen accounts published at the time the event happened where they say, yeah, we tracked down other passengers on the bus who saw him that day. And that could mean, again, a week elapses. Maybe they don't know where those passengers are. How would you might put a call out where you were a passenger on this bus, but there's a good possibility those people might not have been regional. They might have been from some other part of the state or the region and never saw the news about it. In subsequent retellings, I'm glad you brought that up, because in subsequent retellings of this is a story that becomes the most wildly exaggerated. There are stories that Tedford dematerialized. He boards the bus and then he wasn't there when the bus pulled in, but his suitcase was there. Everyone saw him and then they didn't see him anymore. That is not what happened.
Come on, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. There's no air of spookiness about this case in the original telling of the case from the people who were there at the time it happened, the coverage that was there at the time it happened. It was that an older guy who wasn't in great health gets off the bus somewhere. We think it's Brandon. We don't know what happened then. There was some article I found that said he was a traveling salesman. Yeah, a traveling salesman, and his package of sales stuff was left on the. That's not what happened. So I think it's important to pay attention to that. What gets missed in all these retellings is this Brandon connection. You rarely encounter that when you read about the Tedford case, but I think that's really the linchpin of this entire case. We think he probably did get off the bus at Brandon, or at least the evidence would suggest it. We just don't know what happened after that. And I think it's a case that's, that there is a mystery to this, but it's also really sad, that this is a guy who I think was not entering a happy old age. He wasn't where he wanted to be. And I think that happens to a lot of people when they're older and they have to go into some kind of nursing facility. And so I really kind of feel for this guy, and I want to kind of understand and untangle what might have happened. But unfortunately, the evidence as it is doesn't give us a lot. As I mentioned, I have a request out for police records. I've gotten a couple of dead ends from local police departments who say we don't have anything before 1997 in our records room. But it's possible that the clerk that I've worked with the Vermont State Police might uncover something. And if she does, I will let you guys know.
So you have like an inside source.
Well, sort of, yeah. I mean, it's through a public records request, but they're very helpful. These agencies, when you tell them you're doing research on some cold case, people are sort of curious, and they are willing to go through boxes and file cabinets and things like that for you if you just ask.
And you probably meet this person in a parking garage.
I wish it was that mysterious. Unfortunately, it has a lot to do with online web portals and tracking down email addresses and things like that. So it's not quite as exciting as that, though I think it is a pretty cool job. People interested in sort of history and archives and records, there are jobs in police evidence rooms. If you watch the series Dexter, he had a nice friendly relationship with the lady who worked in the records room who helped him out a lot. So that is one of those areas of the sort of library information professions that I think is kind of interesting. So it's possible that there are records in a box somewhere related to this case that may come to light at some point that might give us a little better sense of what might have happened with this guy. What
about family? Does Tedford have any family that's still around in the area today?
There are a lot of Tedfords around in Vermont, and it seems like they may all be related. His wife lived into the 1980s. Because she was born around 1911, 1912. So there are probably extended family, but it was interesting. One of the things that threw the police off is about 3 days after Tedford, maybe more than 3, maybe 3 days, 5 days after Tedford disappeared, a guy named Francis Tedford from Fletcher died. And they initially said, oh, it's no relation to Tedford, but one source said it was his cousin. But the police had this missing persons report. Then they found out there was a death. They're like, wait a minute, is this the same guy? It wasn't the same guy. And about 10 days after Tedford disappeared, another guy named Tedford fell through the ice in Lake Champlain. He ended up being rescued. Incidentally, he walked home, and by the time he got home, his clothes had turned to ice. Not a comfortable way to get home, but another Tedford connection in this one town. So I'm sure there are probably descendants of his brother and other cousins in the area. But because he didn't have kids, I don't know whether there would be a lot of living memory of who Tedford was and what he was like. Though it's possible someone listening to this may come forward saying, "Yeah, that was my great uncle, and my mom talked about him when we were growing up." So there might be people out there who do remember him and could shed some more light onto what was going on in his life during that particular decade. I grew up in a rural area, and similar to this area we're talking about. And, these old guys that were lifelong farmers just have a real kind of charisma to them. Interesting way of living life, interesting views about the world based on this kind of life close to the land. And that's kind of how I picture Tedford being. So when someone disappears without evidence, we can fantasize. Maybe he did make it to Florida. I don't think it's likely, but it's not impossible. Your thumb rides long enough, you eventually find your way to Miami. I mean, we can hope for him that he ended up in a place where he wanted to be. I just don't think the evidence would bear that out. But maybe we'll find out someday.
Wow, Ross. Well, you've done it again. Thank you so much for joining us here today and telling us about this mysterious disappearance of James Tedford as part of the Bennington Triangle cases. We really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. And the next time we talk, we're going to talk about a little boy who wanders away from his mother about a year later and is not seen again. And the investigation into that case and the subsequent case revives the Tedford case. So his case will bubble back up again at some point before we conclude this series.
Amazing. Always leaving us on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, I like to keep people interested.
Okay, we are back here now for final thoughts after the interview with Ross Griffiths about the disappearance of James Tedford. Lance, wow, what a great recounting of this story once again by Ross Griffiths. Definitely one of our favorite guests. He corrects misinformation as well as tells the story. It's pretty impressive.
I'd call it less of an interview and more of you and I sitting cross-legged in front of him while he tells us his story. I mean, and the fact that he's a archives librarian and was telling the story from the archives room.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to make sure that the internet held out, and he's like in his element. And I want to tell people who haven't watched him on Spotify or YouTube, if you just listened to the episode, go and watch this on Spotify or YouTube. He's not reading from a script.
No, he has a great way of recalling these things that he reads.
It's incredible. And every time we talk with him or every time he delivers these stories to us, I'm just always so amazed that he's going through these points in his head and you don't hear papers move. You don't see him reading. It's a really remarkable way to tell the story. And I feel like there aren't many people who are equipped enough to tell the story of James Tedford more than Ross Griffiths.
It's an incredible recounting. So what's most impressive to me is that there was a couple of points where I asked him questions that I expected different answers from because of the research I had done before we started the interview. Those were the questions about how many people saw him on the bus. There were reports out there that there were 14 eyewitnesses, confirmed eyewitnesses. Apparently, there were none. There were also reports of his belongings having been left on the bus, and that's apparently not true either. Apparently, he didn't have any belongings with him. And this was probably the biggest one. There were reports that his wife actually went missing before James did, and maybe that she had just left him, and that was part of why he ended up going missing. But that's not the case at all. Yes, he was living separately, which probably speaks to his decline of health, I would say, mental health and physical health. But his wife did stay with him. So she didn't go missing. She was never missing. So yeah, really interesting because it all kind of leads you to believe that he vanished from this bus and this bus passed through this lost horizon on the road near the Long Trail and poof, he's gone. Well, I hate to bust your bubble, I guess, but that's not apparently what happened. What seems to be more logical is that he probably got off of the bus in Brandon and never got back on the bus.
And I just loved Ross's reason for why he would get off the bus. And again, I said this in the intro, but Ross will give you the disappointing news that his wife didn't go missing, or when the bus stopped, he was there, and when it took off, he was gone. So he must have evaporated into thin air. Like, he'll deliver the bad news in a way where you still are on sort of the edge of your seat. And then when you get the information, you simultaneously are relieved, but then you're like, that makes sense. He probably, as Ross said, got off the bus because he had to go to the bathroom. And
potentially,
there was an inn there. Like, that's probably what happened. I mean, I don't know like what the age has to do with it, but it's a 68-year-old man. I mean, it's such a mundane thing. He probably urinates more frequently than he used to. And after being on the bus for over an hour, he's probably thinking, I should really take the first opportunity to use a restroom here.
Yeah, I would say it's that, or potentially like early signs of dementia. And he didn't really know maybe why he got off the bus or why he was on the bus. Maybe there was some confusion there. Now, what we're left with, though, is still an incredible mystery.
It's just as mysterious, yes.
Yeah, he did go missing and has never been seen again and has never been found. There were searches. There was even this peculiar sighting from a taxi cab driver, apparently 3 hours after he would have departed the bus in Brandon. So that part about speaking about this is interesting because you had said, well, maybe he was just looking for the bus to get back on. And Ross said, well, this was 3 hours after. And so it's like, well, then I think we're talking about dementia really kind of messing with his thoughts, because if that was him, this person was walking around and acting in a bizarre manner. Maybe that was him, and maybe that was signs of dementia. Maybe that wasn't him. I don't know. But I think that's probably our best theory, is that he got off the bus in Brandon and never got back on.
And that would mean that this moment of dementia happened for long enough where he wasn't able to communicate to anybody exactly what was going on. So if he's been passing in and out of dementia, he has moments of clarity previously to this disappearance. So at some point during this disappearance, after he gets off the bus, again, if this was a moment of dementia, that lasted long enough where he wasn't able to communicate who he was and where he was coming from, which is, truly tragic that he's, in a sense, wandering around with this madness happening.
Fearfulness, it seems, and maybe that's why he didn't approach anyone.
Right. When he's in this state of dementia, when he's in this state of fearfulness, I mean, I couldn't even imagine how the human mind is working at that particular stage. And it's really tragic. I do wonder when he would have come out of that for just the briefest moment of clarity. And also, this was around like 9:30 at night as well. It's December 1st, but it's still Vermont and it's still cold and it's dark. I mean, at that point, it's dark. There's a whole lot that is, I don't know, amplified as far as fear goes for somebody in his position. But again, like, there's no sign of him. So maybe he got picked up by somebody else after the taxi driver saw him, and maybe he was driven somewhere and he at some point was, I don't know, like released from the car or, claimed that he was at his location, but then no one else came forward. I mean, all of these disappearances were in the paper, it wasn't like no one knew about it. And if you picked up somebody in that situation, you'd remember that, if you picked up somebody in that condition, you'd probably want to take them to a hospital. You'd probably want to get them help, because he's probably telling a person sort of nonsensical things. Who are you? He probably wouldn't even be able to answer who are you? Where are you coming from? Where are you going?
Yeah. Now, we don't know for sure if that sighting was really James Tedford.
True.
And actually what that moment in this conversation reminded me of was the tsunami ghosts. You ever heard those stories from the
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
tsunami from Japan in 2011,
Yeah.
there were a lot of reports of specifically cab drivers driving around some of those towns and essentially picking up ghosts and or picking up a passenger, and then they look in the rearview mirror and there's no one there. And there was a popular book written on this, and definitely some real accounts of this, whether you believe they're spirits or not, doesn't matter. These accounts happened. Psychologists interviewed about this will tell you that it's PTSD from the people who can't really rationalize like the amount of tragedy that they actually lived through. So they'll say it's not ghosts at all. It's sort of a figment of your imagination, but I don't know where I fall on it. But that's what that sighting reminded me of. And it probably, wasn't that at all. But I just wanted to point that out because I find those tsunami ghosts very interesting.
Sounds like a Crawlspace episode. We should get a tsunami ghost expert on the show. That is a really, really, really fascinating exploration into the effects of PTSD. Like you said, they are unable to process and come to grips with the tragedy that they saw. They can't separate that from, the memory.
Or they're real ghosts.
I'm wondering if that cab driver might have had PTSD. Maybe that cab driver had been in the war as well and was having issues dealing with situations like that. But now we're going down sort of another road here.
Yeah. Well, we can pull out of this rabbit hole now. But yeah, really interesting stuff on this case. I wish I had a better theory of what actually happened to him, though. I just don't know because, I know we said that he didn't go poof and then disappear, but he kind of did.
He kind of did, yeah. But there's a blurb on Wikipedia about James Tedford, and it's in the Bennington Triangle Wikipedia page that I just, like, every time I read this, I just laugh because author Tony Jinks is quoted. I guess he's written about the disappearance, and he says, regarding Tedford's disappearance, there is enough evidence to suggest he did not, quote, dematerialize, even though no trace of him was ever found. I just find it funny that evidence was even being examined. Like, what evidence would suggest anybody would dematerialize? Is that a thing? Has that ever been proven that a human being has dematerialized?
No, there was a very odd story. I think it was on Unsolved Mysteries a couple decades ago, about spontaneous human combustion. And yep. I believe the man had a lot of alcohol in his system.
Yeah, I remember that. He was like in bed or something.
Yeah, I believe so. So I think he kind of ignited. But still, that's not dematerializing. There was evidence afterwards,
Yeah. Just by putting that out there, the way it's worded, that there was evidence to suggest that he did not. And not the other way around, not saying there is no evidence here. There's evidence to suggest that he did not dematerialize, as if that has been a thing in history where investigators have to rule out when it comes to missing people. Was it the dematerialization? Oh, check that off the list. And per usual, Ross leaves us with a cliffhanger, as anybody who's made it this far into the episode knows. When you listen to Ross at the pretty much very end of him telling one story, he'll drop a little bit of a indication of the mystery that will be discussed for the following story, our subsequent story. And the next one that he's going to be bringing to us is Paul Jepson, another Bennington Triangle disappearance. Can't wait to sit down with Ross and have him recount that story.
All right, everyone. Thanks a lot for listening. Please follow us on social media at MissingCSM.